welcome to Up Close with Carlos Sang, celebrating art, entertainment, and the human spirit. Welcome to another episode of Up Close with Carlos Sang. My next guest is one of my favourite pianists and also one of my favourite people. After winning the BBC Young Musician of the Year award in 2014, he has very much conquered the classical music scene and has recently released his most recent album, La Danse. It's a huge pleasure to be able to introduce the wonderful Martin James Bartlett. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was looking back and, it's been 5 years, since we last spoke like this. And, it's been 10 years since you won BBC Young Musician of the Year. Do you still consider yourself to be a young musician?
Do you know, that's a really interesting question. I guess in the whole scheme of one's life, I would hope that I would be still considered young at the age of 27 years. However, in terms of a young musician, it's really interesting as to where that boundary is. Because, I started off being a professional musician when I was 17. So now, as you say, I'm a decade on into the industry. So I'm sort of doing that transition between, to put it in the perspective of festivals, lots of festivals have a young artist program where they invite a young up-and-coming artist, like a rising star. And then they have their main series, which is the very famous big name artists who are considered maestri. So I'm sort of actually in between the two of those because I'm a bit too old to be invited on as a young upcoming star, but I'm also not quite famous enough to be invited as one of the big stars. So I'm kind of in that transitional period, actually. So actually, it's probably a much longer answer than you expected. But I do consider myself a young person, but not necessarily a young artist.
I see. It's very interesting. As you've gotten older as well, do you feel like your measure of success has changed as well? And how do you measure success as an artist?
I think when I was younger, I was very, very hungry for opportunities. Not to say that I'm not now, but I think now I do like to pick and choose a bit more as to what is best for me. And I think a lot more. Beforehand, I could be asked to do 4 different concerti in like a space of 2 weeks. And I would say, yeah, I'm down to do it. And I would push myself so hard. And now I sort of think, no, I need to have some kind of balance. And I need to look after myself health-wise, and also be able to occasionally see friends rather than just see them once a year. So in that sense, I think now I'm a bit more realistic about what I can do and what I can't do. And I push myself, but I don't push myself over the edge, which I think I used to actually when I was younger.
Yeah, I mean, when we first met as well, you obviously had just released your first album, Love and Death. You recently released your third album, La Danse. The fourth, if you include the Philip Glass album as well. When you look back, do you feel like your style or technique has changed particularly at all too?
It might sound a bit big-headed to say, but I'm really relieved actually that when I look back at that album, the first album I released, I'm still proud of it, and I guess it's not that far on for me to have huge artistic changes. I think you change quite slowly artistically. I felt quite set with those pieces that I was performing, Widmung and Granados Love and Death, which was sort of the catalyst to the album. I played them a lot. So I felt quite set in my interpretation. I was quite happy with how I was presenting them. And now I look back and I still feel that I would probably play it quite similarly today. Whether or not that will be the same in 15 or 20 years, I don't know. But if you look at the Glenn Gould Bach recordings that he released of the Goldberg variations, he didn't release them, just a couple of years after each other. They're sort of like a whole lifetime in between. And I think it's artistic progression moves at a glacial pace. It's very slow and very incremental, but you sort of look back and go, oh my gosh, how was I playing like that before? But maybe in 50 years I will think differently. But now I'm quite pleased with how everything's gone. But I can hear a progression, of course, in the sound, but it's nothing drastic, really.
Yeah, I mean that's really encouraging to hear. I mean, each of your albums have been, so clearly carefully crafted, and they're such a pleasure to listen to. Do you have like a common starting point for, how to begin crafting an album, and when do you sort of know when, you've created a finished product?
Well, that's a really good question because I think lots of people approach creating albums very differently. I usually like to create something that is thematic because I think themes are really helpful ways to people to understand music. And for me, I get very excited about connections between things, composer relationships to other composers, to their wife, to their mistress, to their lover, their secret lover. I find all of this stuff really fascinating, and I think it can really inform you about the music and the person. So I like thematic programs. Usually it starts from a point of what pieces I'm playing at the given time, because I can come up with all kind of wild program ideas, all of the Prokofiev concertos, for example, but I don't play most of them. So you need to have something that you've already got in your repertoire that you feel comfortable enough to put on disc, and then sort of work around it. So every one of my albums have come from a specific piece or pieces that I've been performing at the time.
Mm.
And then it sort of spiraled, like La Danse, the most recent album. That comes from Rameau, the French Baroque composer. He wrote a set of variations, and then Ravel wrote La Valse. Both French, both dances from entirely different eras and entirely different music. But I was playing both of them, and I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to sort of do a chronological line of order from Baroque through to Impressionist and see everything that comes French in that way? So that's sort of how they're all planned as sort of journeys for the listener and historically.
Yeah, I mean, it's always great to watch you perform, as you say, and get the applause that you very rightfully deserve. But when you're going into a recording studio, does it ever feel strange, performing for yourself as such?
Do not really, because when you're on stage and you have an audience there, obviously you feel the frisson of people being there, and that's exciting, gets the adrenaline going. But also there is a nervousness to it, and with those nerves can come mistakes. You can do silly things that you don't usually do because you're not sort of you're walking on eggshells because you're aware that there are so many people there listening. When you're in a studio, you have the freedom to do whatever you want, and you can try that bit. Let's say there's this 5 bar section that's really complicated, and maybe in a concert, especially if it's on radio or something like that, or there are lots of people, or there are reviewers, you might take it a bit slower just to make sure you get it right so that it's okay. Now, in the recording studio, you can do that bit 20, 30, 40 times if you've got a very nice and generous producer who's willing to sit there whilst you do it over and over again. But that means you can say, how would I best present this bit if I could just do it over and over again and get that perfect version? And that's something really nice about recording studio time, is that you have the ability just to play something over and over again until you absolutely nail it.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's also, amazing just to, have these, souvenirs of time as well, to get to play these music, on demand. And, it's amazing, how music is so accessible now as well. Do you feel like it's important to, to record music and, to have something, from that period of your life?
I think it really is hugely important. The music in the classical music industry, it's very strange because what we do is we create something that is totally fleeting. It's a sound, and then it nearly instantaneously disappears, and it only lives on probably in the people's heads who've heard it, who remember the experience. So if you don't record it and you don't put anything onto disc, it's a bit like an artist painting the most beautiful thing and then just sort of ripping it up, but a couple of people seeing it and them going, that's probably the most beautiful painting I've ever seen, and then they just burn it and it's gone. So in that sense, and you would think, well, an artist would never do that. Some of them did, but artists would never really do that. The reason the great artists are artists now is because we have this amazing historical set of documents of what they did and how their artistic vision changed. It's like that with music. So it's important to put it onto disc, but important to realize that it doesn't have to necessarily be the finished article on disc. And I don't think, truthfully, it ever can be. You can never say you're quite finished with something. You can say you're content, but it's like artists who redo portraits years later, you know, who do different versions of things. I was reading a book about Caravaggio, who's one of my favorite artists, but for the tenebrism and the black and white, you know, this incredible shadowing. But he did Supper at Emmaus, which is where Jesus comes back and the disciples are there and they're utterly shocked that he's reappeared. He painted it twice in his life in entirely different styles. One, when he was younger, slightly less troubled, and it's beautiful, and the flesh is beautifully rosy and warm. And then older, when he was in terrible troubles personally, it's darker and the wrinkles are deeper and it's sullen. And I think that's what music's like. You know, you can paint something once, but it doesn't mean you're finished with that topic. You might want to revisit it.
Yeah. So you reckon you'll revisit any of your music, you know, in the future as well?
I think it's quite possible. I've just made a recording that's coming out, not yet, but next year, of Bach. It's my first recording of purely Bach. I've played Bach transcriptions, but I haven't played just Mr. Bach. So I've made a recording with an orchestra in Salzburg, the Mozarteum Orchestra, and our recording it's really full of energy. I mean, I'm really pleased. It's electric, it's exciting, it's got a lot of energy behind it. I love that. Whether or not in 50 years I will look back at it and want a recording that is far more stately and sort of regal, it's quite possible I might, because your artistic visions change throughout life. You know, when you're younger, you like everything fiery and impassioned, and then as you're older, you look more for the subtlety and refinement and things. So it's possible.
Absolutely. I was also very curious in there as well, you know, in your free time, you know, what sort of music do you normally like to listen to? And, you know, are there any particular artists that you like to follow too?
That's a very good question. I love cooking in my spare time, as I'm sure you know from Instagram. It's full of food. I love listening to jazz. I find it very hard to listen to classical music in a sort of relaxing way, because I find it makes me so emotional, and it resonates so much with me that I find it very hard just to pop classical music on in the background and not be drawn into it. You know, I know some people do classical music for studying and they listen to classical music and they study. I couldn't even read my revision notes, you know, if I had Beethoven's Symphony number 7 blaring out in the background, because I can't detach myself from the music, you know. So yeah, jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, I adore Frank Sinatra, you know, the Rat Pack, I love jazz. But of course, classical music, I'm not really that up on pop music, which I don't think comes as a massive surprise that I don't know that much about pop music. I couldn't tell my Cardi B's from my Nicki Minaj's.
You're not a Taylor Swift fan at all?
Who? No, I'm joking. No, I know nothing about it really, but you know, I hear them on the radio sometimes, and I think, oh, that's nice and catchy, but it's not really quite my bag, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking back as well, you know, the last time that we spoke, I asked you about you know, what advice you would give to young aspiring performers, and you talked about, you know, the importance of, you know, taking on board criticism. And I was wondering, you know, how do you normally take criticism, and, you know, is that ever hard to hear for you at all too?
I think it's very important to be able to give criticism well. I've thought about this a lot. It's very important to take criticism, but it's also very important, if you're in the position of giving criticism to someone in order to help them, to give it in a way that's productive and not a way that's just sort of stealing a bit of their energy. So in that sense, I have received criticism before where I've just shrugged it off, like reviews. You know, when you receive reviews from concerts, half the time they're utterly contrasting. You know, for the last album, I received a review of La Valse, the Ravel piece I play, and one reviewer said that it was brilliant and sparkling and full of light and absolutely joyous. Unfortunately, I had missed the darkness that is in this piece inherently. And then another review countered by saying, it's so dark and menacing, you struggle to find any light amongst all of the shadows that he creates. And I think, well, how can you have two reviews that are totally the opposite? So it's very subjective. But I think that stuff I take with a pinch of salt. Reviews, if they're great, brilliant, pop them on the website. If they're not, in the trash. Whereas if it's mentors, teachers, I think it's just important to realize that clearly the reason someone's telling you something is for your own good. And I think it's important to be reflective enough on yourself that you can interpret what they're saying.
Yeah.
And what it actually means to you. And I think when you get a bit of criticism from someone who's in a position to want to help you, take it for a bit. Don't let it drag you down, but have a think about what exactly they mean and try and work a way that you can use it in a way to better yourself rather than just make you miserable.
Yeah. What would you say has been, the biggest piece of advice that you have received as an artist too?
I mean, I've received so many specific pieces of advice in terms of within the music, about how to play things stylistically, which is all very helpful. One thing I heard from a friend who is very good friends with Dame Kiri Te Kanawa, the amazing opera star, is she was asked this same question, what advice would you give young artists today? And she said, watch the money. Your agents, everyone, they'll always try and take your money. So that was her bit of advice. And I have a great agent, so thankfully I trust them wholeheartedly. But I think it's important to be savvy about the business. I think that's her point, is it's very easy in the old days. You'd just show up, you'd sing, play beautifully, and then you'd get booked for another gig. And that's how it would work. Now it's far more complicated. You need to be savvy on social media. You need to have all of these attributes that you need to learn. You can't just turn out and be a mega talent. You have to learn how to sort out your finances and pay your bleeding taxes and all of this stuff. And I think that's something I would say to someone is work incredibly hard at your craft, practice the piano, practice singing, musical theatre, whatever. But in the meantime, build up techniques of how to deal with the actual business of what you're doing. Because I think most people, it's the business that wears them down in the end. It's not the actual music and, what they're doing. They love that. It's all the other crap that comes with it, along the way. So I would say be savvy about your career.
Absolutely. Yeah, very wise words. Something that I didn't know about you when we first met was that you are from Essex, and there's not very much a hint of an Essex accent, and I was wondering why that was, and if there ever was an accent at all too.
Well, I think some of my friends will testify that if I've had a few too many glasses of vino, that an Essex accent might reappear. However, I went to boarding school, when I was young, and I think when you're surrounded by so many different nationalities and so many different accents, that you sort of lose your own, if I ever had it. The thing is, I was born in Essex, but my mother's not from Essex, and she doesn't have an Essex accent. And my mother talks a lot in a very wonderful way. But it means, if I'm surrounded by her voice when I'm growing up, it's unlikely I'm going to talk with an Essex twang, really.
Okay, very interesting to hear. Yeah, I also feel like among some groups, there's still sometimes this view that classical music is it's very elitist and it's not, completely open to the masses as well. And, I wanted to, gather your view on, how, we could make, classical music, seem more accessible to, more people too.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for this question because there are so many great answers about it. And I'm going to say classical music isn't elitist. That's the argument I'm going to put forward because I
Okay.
don't believe it is. You can get to Wigmore Hall, very cheap tickets, student tickets. I was rush tickets for the opera. You can end up at the Royal Opera House for quite cheap seats. And I look at it and I think people are willing to bring back Taylor Swift. I believe that was her name earlier. People are willing to spend hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds to go to concerts like that. And it's not considered elitist. It's considered music for the masses.
Mm.
And I don't quite understand why splashing out on a 50, £60 opera ticket when the same amount of work, if not more, with the set and the design. I know there are sets for these big superstar, pop star concerts, but still a huge amount of effort's gone in. And I don't understand why it's made that classical music is so elitist and totally unapproachable, because I don't believe it is.
Yeah, I mean, it
Just
is.
believe it's easier to get some excitement from a pop concert than it is to actually delve into classical music, which is inherently more complicated and has more intricacies to the story and to the art form.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, do you think, classical music will ever become, more mainstream and, they will gather an audience, like, say Taylor Swift or, any other pop artists too?
I think it's hard because I think it's not necessarily the best art form. It has an intimacy to classical music. If we look back at classical music being in salons and being is more a sharing of things, whereas pop music is something that's very easy to churn out for millions of people in a mic'd up and everything like that in the Hollywood Bowl, for example,
Mm.
in huge places. I don't think it's as easy for classical music to go through that sort of prism. I think it's far more an intimate event. And in a way, I hope it doesn't, because I think some of the joy and the beauty of classical music is being one of the last things left in the whole world that is based around traditions. You know, Half the time we're getting rid of traditions for good reason because they're not uh, supposed to be in this day and age. But there are some lovely traditions that I don't think we should lose. Dressing up and going to a concert and having a pre-theatre dinner and things. I know people will say, well, only if you've got the money. And I would say, well, yes, of course, only if you've got the money, but only if you've got the money to go on a holiday to Barbados and things. It just depends what you spend your money on. And I
Absolutely.
don't think classical music is particularly expensive to go out and enjoy if you're willing to dip your feet in the water.
Mm. Absolutely. I mean, at the same time, it is still encouraging to see, that there is an audience for, classical music. We've got the prom season every year, these
Right.
large concert halls are still constantly being filled, the our major orchestras are still having still have their audience. What do you see as being, the future of classical music too?
Or, well, I think it's hard to say because I have a feeling that classical music is something that sometimes people come to with age.
Mm.
You know, you have a love of classical music and be very young, as do I. But I do think some people come to it as they get older. And I know lots of people now who are in their 50s and 60s who come along to concerts and say, I wasn't interested in classical music when I was young. I loved the music of the day, whatever that popular music was. But as time's gone on and my personality's softened or I've mellowed a bit, I've chilled out a bit, I've got older, I find that classical music speaks to me more. So I would say to the people who argue about, well, it's really older audiences and the audiences are dying out, I think it's just a continual cycle, probably, of young people who, as they age, find classical music more meaningful to them. And I think that will just continue as it does. I think the art form is too great for it to be, for it to sink, actually. Well, I hope.
Yeah, I agree. I think it will definitely continue to live on. You mentioned Instagram earlier, and you're obviously, very active on social media. I was wondering, do you ever get, recognized, when you're on the streets and, going about your own business?
Oh, all the time. I've only been recognised. I can count the times on one finger. Um, I, no, I have been recognised, but not particularly often. And I'd love to be recognised a little more often. I find it funny how celebrities are sort of they find it shocking that people would wish to talk to them in the street sometimes. But I would love it, of course, if I was recognised more. But also, it is a godsend in a way that you don't get sort of constantly harassed when you're trying to have lunch or dinner. Um, but I guess that's the point of classical music is it is quite, uh, it's small circles in a way. So you're never, I remember when I was in Verbier, one of the greatest music festivals in the world in the Swiss Alps, and Marta Argerich, one of my all-time favs, Argentinian pianist, now in her 80s, extraordinary lady, was performing there. And she is, she's probably the most iconic classical musician alive, you could argue.
Mm.
So she's the equivalent of Beyonce, basically, in the classical music world. And she was shopping in a little supermercado, and she was just buying milk and some bread for the chalet she was staying in, and everyone was just walking past her. And I sat there in the corner thinking, gosh, this is my hero.
Mm.
And I think just the classical music world it is quite small in a way, and it is intimate that you don't, even the big heroes of the classical music world, they aren't mobbed on the street.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to ask as well, because I know that 2 years ago you made your conducting debut in Cheltenham and also in Rydale as well, with the London
Yes,
Met Players. How was that? How was that experience for you as well? Getting to conduct an orchestra for the first time.
really, really cool, actually. One thing, of course, there's the benefit of you get to take the conductor's fee and the pianist's fee, which is wonderful for the bank balance. But in terms of artistically, it's a really nice thing because you somehow feel like you, with the orchestra yourself, you're curating and creating the whole interpretation from the ground up. You're not working with a conductor who may have in very different ideas about the piece to you, may
Mm.
have a very different ideal as to how it should be performed, and then you're in a constant compromise between the two of you, and neither of you can necessarily. This is not all the time this happens, but occasionally, you can feel like you're compromising and you're not content quite with what you're doing. Now, when you conduct an orchestra as well as perform from the keyboard, everything is in your hands and the orchestra's hands, and it's chamber music. And for me, chamber music is one of the greatest things about classical music is that it's sharing together music, learning from each other. So I love it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you've gone to work with some, fabulous conductors, from, John Wilson to Mark Wigglesworth to Jonathan Bloxham, and, with some great orchestras as well. How would you, yeah, describe that, relationship between soloist and conductor, and, what do you think it is that makes a great conductor too?
Oh, what makes a great conductor? I think probably times have changed. I think if you look back in the day of Herbert von Karajan, what made a great conductor was an incredibly strong leader who had a incredibly strong opinion about the music and in interpretation, and they set that with the orchestra. It was you follow the leader, Herbert von Karajan, you do as he says. And I think over a period of time, there's been far more changes in the industry and the way you make music. And now a conductor is more a facilitator. It's having interpretation, but it's also working with orchestral musicians and not laying down the law, so to speak, but actually being able to listen, being able to, and be a collaborative partner. So I think that's changed a lot. I have some of my greatest experiences with Jonathan Bloxham because he's one of my best friends, and he's also a fabulous musician. And we get to travel the world doing concerts with incredible orchestras, amazing music, and after the rehearsal we get to go and drink a glass of wine and have a nice meal and hang out. So what's greater than that is working with your friends.
Mm, absolutely. I mean, you've always been, you've always come across so lovely as well, and you're always so warm and generous to everyone around you. And it kind of got me thinking, what is Martin James Bartlett like on a bad day?
Oh, you'd have to ask. You'd have to ask my family about that. I don't. This sounds awful. I don't really have bad days that much. I try to come at life with a positive aspect that when I wake up in the morning, however shit my week's been or the day before's been, I just try and start from scratch again. And I don't really have bad days. Probably the worst you'll ever see me in terms of personality wise is if I'm very, very nervous. And if I have a very big concert and I'm incredibly nervous before it, and it's the run up to that concert, and maybe things aren't going quite as planned, stuck in traffic, or the orchestral rehearsal orders moved or something like that, at that point I think I can be a bit short with people. Thankfully, the people who surround me at those points of my life realize that it's not me, it's sort of the stress and the strain. I was also reading about Dame Kiri Te Kanawa, that when she did concerts, she wouldn't talk to anyone on the day of the concert until she did it. She didn't want anyone to break her focus. And I think if you were someone asking her whether she'd like a cup of tea and you got blanked, you might think that she was absolutely awful. But it's just that same thing of we all deal with stress differently. And when I'm stressed out, I can be a bit of a bitch. Apart from that, I think I'm generally pleasant.
Well, I've never seen you be a bitch before, but I mean,
Thanks.
that's very encouraging. Yeah, just as a last question, what do you most want to be remembered for?
Well, I think obviously it's going to be music, but if it's anything specific about music, I think I'd like to be remembered for the diversity of music that I play, across so many different. I don't specialize in specific things. I'm not a Baroque specialist. I'm not a French music specialist. I sort of try and play everything. And if it's anything, I would like people to perhaps say, well, he had a knack of playing things from all different areas of classical music and at least somehow put his own stamp on it. I'd like to be remembered for having an individual voice rather than someone repeating the notes off a piece of paper.
Martin James Bartlett, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.